Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We will just wait a couple seconds to let people get settled in. All right, and we are now live on World Beyond War's YouTube channel. And Susan, you can kick us off.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. It is a pleasure to welcome you to a webinar jointly sponsored by World Beyond War and Veterans for Peace, one of a number of collaborations between an organization that seeks to end wars and those of us who have been to war, witnessed the horrors, and now dedicate ourselves to peace and justice. Our panel was formed as an adjunct to the release of the documentary, The People versus Agent Orange, an extraordinary work that shows the use of a toxic herbicide at home in the state of Oregon and abroad in Southeast Asia. 60 years ago, the United States used approximately 19 million gallons of 15 different herbicides, including 13 million gallons of Agent Orange, over southern Vietnam, over Cambodia, and over Laos. Between 2.1 and 4.8 million Vietnamese were exposed during the spraying, and many more continued to be exposed through the environment. Agent Orange exposure continues to negatively affect the lives of men and women in Vietnam and in the United States. Agent Orange exposure is associated with cancers, immune deficiencies, reproductive illnesses, and severe birth defects in Vietnamese American and Vietnamese Americans who were directly exposed, as well as their children and grandchildren. Agent Blue contained arsenic. It was a deliberate destruction of the food supply. A 1970 telegram from the Office of Science and Technology at the White House to the United States Embassy in Paris and the US Embassy in Saigon requested information regarding allegations of birth defects in South Vietnam following, quote, heavy defoliation operations. In 1978, Vietnam Veterans Against the War wrote about a time bomb in American Vietnam veterans and Vietnamese called Agent Orange. And they talked about the thousands of cases of birth defects of children born to mothers sprayed by the chemicals and the millions of Vietnamese who became ill from contact with the herbicides. An Air Force study of ranch hand personnel, that was the crew that sprayed from C-123s the herbicide over southern Vietnam. They identified a statistically significant increase in reported birth defects in this group, as reported by Richard Albanese in 1988. The birth defects included skin defects, neural tube defects, heart defects, oral clefts, kidney defects. Another study reported that risks for fathering an infant with spina bifida, cleft lip, and certain neoplasms were higher for Vietnam veterans than controls. And the impact continued. Studies on exposure to women near Da Nang Airport in 2009 by Hatfield identified the maximum level of dioxin in breast milk. In 2013, there were 216 mother-infant pairs near Da Nang who were followed from birth until the infants were 4 months old. They found moderate and high DDI levels, significantly lower cognitive composite motor development, and fine motor scores below level. It is indeed a pleasure to introduce you to Tran Thi Huan, born in Binh Thuan Province, Vietnam, without lower extremities and also missing a hand. Her mother, a farm worker, was exposed to Agent Orange. Huan is a graduate of the Ho Chi Minh City University of Foreign Languages and Information Technology with a certificate in computer science. She is currently a program planner at To Do Hospital in Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam. Her transportation is a four-wheeled scooter that she uses to ride around the city. Juan wanted to be a doctor, as you will hear from her interview, but she couldn't realize her dream because of her multiple physical birth defects. Juan has just started a new job and couldn't be with us in person, but here she is in a recording. Tran Thi Juan.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tran Thi Juan. I'm 25 years old. I was born in Binh Thuong province, the south in Vietnam. I was born without 2 legs and 1 hand. Now I live and work in Ho Chi Minh City in To Do Hospital. My job is about programmer. My mother was exposed to Agent Orange when she's pregnant me. So that's why I was born without 2 legs and 1 hand. When I was 8 years old, I moved to Peace Village and lived with 60 children had the same situation. Peace Village is a center take care of victims of Agent Orange. I growing up in Peace Village and I graduate IT in University Ho Chi Minh City University of Foreign Languages and Information Technology. I used to have a dream I can be a doctor, but because my situation, I cannot do that, and that's why I choose computer and study and work. I'm a lucky person. Why I say I'm a lucky person? Because I grown up in a good environment. I have a Peace Village take care of me because in there I have a doctor and nurse take care of my health and everything instead of my parents, and then I can go to school and I can graduate university, and then I have a good job. Right now I rent I have a rent house in District 2, and I work in To Do Hospital in District 1. Every day I drive a motorbike with the 4 wheels to go to work. It's about 12 kilometers from my rent house to hospital. Now I have a good job, so I will want to improve myself more, and I can help another friend have the same situation, and other people have the same situation like me.
If you could talk a little bit more about To Do Hospital in the Peace Village. What is To Do Hospital? Where is it? What's its function? And then the Peace Village, especially if you could go on about your brothers and sisters who were there and still are, and what's the range of issues that they might be having.
Peace Village is a part of To Do Hospital. To Do Hospital is in Ho Chi Minh City. It's in District 1, and Peace Village is a center to take care of victims of Agent Orange. I moved there in 1994, and I live with 60 children had the same situation, and all of them, most of them, they are victims of Agent Orange. Most of them don't have parents, and they're growing up with me.
Can you describe some of the other birth defects and disabilities that the children that have lived in Peace Village have?
In Peace Village, I live with 60 children with different deformity. Example, bow leg, earless, multi-joint stiffness, and thoracic deformity, mental deficiency.
I mean, I visited the Peace Village a number of times, and I found the love and the community there to be very, very moving. That everyone recognizes that we're all individuals and we all have things to offer, so if you could talk about that, the ways in which you, the children, all supported each other.
Every day we wake up together, and we share the same room. We have let's say, and every day we go to school together, and hospital give us ambulance
Mhm.
car. You call it ambulance car or just ambulance?
Just ambulance, yeah.
Sometimes we use ambulance from hospital to go to school, because that time maybe the car in the hospital were busy, and so we have to use ambulance to go to school. And at night we watch movie together, because we have a television, a big television, and then we can see and we have a I'll say. And at night, when some people have, when some children have a sad story, or they miss house, we can share and we can tell. I really miss that time.
And you know, the hospital is also staffed with nurses and doctors. Could you talk about your relationship with them?
Yeah.
And volunteers, I assume, too, right?
Yeah, in Peace Village, maybe have 30 or 40 doctor and nurse. Doctor, we have 3 doctors, and others is a nurse and staff.
Which is, you know, taking care of disabled children is a tall order.
Yeah.
They've really done terrific work. What is going to happen with the Peace Village? With you're up to date on the Peace Village being moved away from the hospital?
Oh, well, 1 year ago, I heard the Peace Village will close, and when the Orange Village finish building, the children will move there to live. But up to now, that project I don't hear again. Okay. And maybe children still live there until the Orange Village complete.
And the Orange Village will be at what, at the edge of Hanoi, outside of town?
The Orange Village, that is a huge project because it's in Hóc Môn district in Ho Chi Minh City. It's far away from District 1. Mm-hmm. India have many park, like, and also I hear, hold on, it will be have swimming pool, we have a garden, we have the house for how say, the house for, the area, the park, a park for children live together like Peace Village, and also have some small house for some victim. They got married, and they have children. They will have a small house in that area, and they can live, and and also have a vocational center too in Orange in Orange really too.
Well, that's
Yeah,
good.
it's huge. So now we have to get no, the VAVA will get a fundraiser. Fundraiser, is it? Is it right word? Yeah,
Yeah.
we get a fundraiser and support from many people. We have to finish Orange Village, but that is big, huge. I don't know how long it will finish. That's a big area.
Would you tell me about your schooling, your college education?
In the beginning, when I come to Peace Village, the first school, a primary school, that is the first school I study, and I study with the disabled children too. I studied there for 4 years, and after that, our government asked have to close the disabled school, and let the disabled person can go out and study with other student. So that's why my first school, primary school, it's closed, and I moved to another primary school to study. And in the beginning, I studied with other students. That time, I really know a difference between me and other students. I work slowly, and I step on stair. It's very difficult, and my teacher, because every morning everyone have to stand in the schoolyard, and then they move up to the class, but because I work so slow, so my teacher asked me I can go up there first. I don't need to stand in the schoolyard with other students. That time very sad for me. And one day when I feel so sad because some children also said some bad word to me, and I feel so sad when I finish the first semester. I back home in Tet holiday, and I asked my father that I don't want to back Saigon to live and study. I just want to stay here with you. So my father just keep quiet for 5 minutes, and then he said to me, I just have one dream, that you can graduate university, and then you can have a good job in future. Because when we die, he means that he and my mother, he said, because when we die, nobody can take care of you, just yourself. And you have to be strong. And just in Peace Village and Saigon have a good life for you, a good future for you. So you have to try. Well, when I hear that he just have one dream, it's really moved my heart. And well, I could not say anything after he said that, Yeah, I just try back, and in my mind, I will have one purpose, that I have to graduate university. So that's why when I have any difficult, I try to overcome it. And finally, I finished my father's dream that I can graduate university.
Done a wonderful job.
Thank you.
As tough as that was, you really did, but you've done very well. So.
Yeah, and another thing have made me stronger, because I got really love. I got a love from doctor and nurse in the hospital, and a good take care from my hospital. and Peace Village. So I think I should try and never give up in my life to finish.
It's good advice for all of us to remember today, to keep going and never give up. Our next speaker is Heather Bowser. Heather is from Canfield, Ohio, the daughter of an American Vietnam veteran. Heather is an Agent Orange activist who was born with multiple birth defects due to her father's exposure to Agent Orange. She is the founder of Children of Vietnam Veterans Health Alliance. It's a pleasure to introduce you to Heather Bowser.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today. I appreciate it, and I'm thankful for every one of you being here and trying to learn more about this issue. So to tell a little bit about my story, my father was in Vietnam from 1968 to 1969. He was at the Long Binh base in the Dong Nai province, just outside of Bien Hoa. In the year that he was there, it was Agent Orange was sprayed quite heavily, and the compound of the Agent Orange at that time was quite heavy with dioxin. This was during the time when the manufacturing of Agent Orange had kind of gone awry a little bit. They were trying to make too much too quick in order to make the most money, I suppose, that the chemical companies could at that time. And unfortunately, it was heavily contaminated with dioxin at that time. And in the geography of where my father's base was, it wasn't very far from Bien Hoa, and that's where Operation Ranch Hand, the planes would fly in and out of. It was about 13 miles away from that base. And from reports from other veterans I have heard is that they were told not to come back with any remaining chemical from their sorties. So what they would do is they would dump it alongside the river that ran alongside my father's base in some instances. And so when people think about Agent Orange, they think a lot of times that you had to actually be in the jungle in order to be exposed to Agent Orange. But honestly, bases were sprayed pretty heavily. The perimeters were sprayed heavily. And also, it was in the water supply around the bases as well. So their clothes were washed in it, their milk was mixed in it, their food was prepared in it. There are pictures of barrels that were reused, where they would put water in barrels for showers and let them heat up in the sun. And when the men would come back from being out, that they would shower with these barrels. With the water from these barrels that had been heated in the sun. And it just takes per trillionth of dioxin to contaminate people. So fast forward to my father coming home, and when my father came home, my parents wanted to start a family. They had been married 9 days before my father left for Vietnam. And when they wanted to put the war behind them and move on. Well, unfortunately, my mother had 2 miscarriages. And then in 1972, prior to there being sonograms or those kinds of things, I was born 2 months premature. I weighed 3 pounds, 4 ounces, and I'm missing my fingers and my right leg below the knee and my big toe on my left foot. And I also have a little bit of a banding around my ankle on my good leg. 3 pounds, 4 ounces. My father, who was a steel worker, said he could hold me in his hands like this. I was so little. They had no idea why I was born that way. They were shocked and surprised. They had no prior warning. So my mother says that she woke up with my father at her bedside saying that I was damaged, that they did not know if I would actually survive. They told my parents, well, it's the 70s, so they were concerned. They asked my mother about drug use. They asked my anything like that, alcohol abuse, nothing like that. They told my mother that if they were that damaged on the outside, generally they were that damaged on the inside, and they didn't have much hope that I would be okay. Fortunately, I was okay, but it was a very scary time. My mom talked about the fact that they had to leave me at the hospital because I was so small. Until I weighed 6 pounds, they wouldn't allow me to be discharged from the hospital. So she talked about the heartbreak of having 2 miscarriages, not knowing what was causing those things, to actually also to leaving her newborn child in a hospital. So it was a very, very difficult time for them. The local pediatrician came busting into my mother's room one day and just asked her, what the hell did she do to this baby? I mean, it's just such a shaming thing that they felt that, my parents, each of them thought that they had done something to cause this, but they had no idea what had happened, and they each blamed themselves. The hospital basically gave me to them and off they went with no kind of guidance as to what to happen next, what would happen with me, how to make sure that I would be okay, that I would have a prosthetic leg, anything like that. Thankfully for the Shriners organization, they actually paid for my prosthetic leg from time I was really little. I started walking on a prosthetic limb when I was 9 months old to when I was 18. So that was really beneficial for my family, because unfortunately, when my father was 38 years old, he worked as a steel worker. And when he was 38 years old, he went to work and he felt like he had a chest cold a little bit. And he went to the infirmary and they checked him out and they said, you need to go to the hospital right away. And when they took my father to the local hospital, they discovered that he was in need of 5 bypasses on his heart. He was only 38 years old. So they couldn't do that at the local hospital. So they needed to rush him to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania's hospital, because this was 1986. So 5 arteries in a heart in 1986 was pretty massive surgery. It was 2 weeks before Christmas, of course, because it can't be any other time of the year. So it was a very difficult time. 2 weeks before Christmas, 50-50 shot whether my father would live or not. And it was just financially, emotionally devastating to our family. They tried to transport him. They wanted to transport him by helicopter from Steubenville area to Pittsburgh by life flight. However, even sedated, the sounds of the helicopter were causing his heart rate to increase. So they scrapped that and took him by ambulance. He survived the surgery. And because he was a steel worker and a laborer and 38 years old, they expected him to go back to work. He was off work for a year. My mother worked a job, but wasn't enough to cover the bills. The VA at that time was not acknowledging anything to do with Agent Orange or any kind of causes of issues. So they denied him, disability denied him. And eventually he had to go back to work, and he worked in the steel mill. At around 40, he developed diabetes, which is another issue from Agent Orange. And at 48, he had a stroke. And then at age 50, unfortunately, he had a massive heart attack and died. That was 23 years ago this past month. Devastating. My parents never financially caught up. In 1986, they had $100,000 worth of medical bills. And it just constantly, it was just always such a stressor on our lives and what it was like. Growing up different was really difficult. My father had some PTSD, and like Juan, she talked about, kids saying mean things and how hard that was. I always kept those to myself. I was bullied quite a bit in elementary school and middle school. And I kept it to myself because I was always afraid that my father would set some kids straight. And I didn't want my Vietnam vet father to go set someone straight, if you can understand that. So it took until a teacher also started bullying me that I actually fessed up, and then my parents left within 10 minutes to go to the teacher's house. So I had reasons not to not to rat, but being different was really difficult. Being isolated, the Agent Orange movement took off. Like in the early 80s, there was a large contingency of Vietnam veterans and their children in the Akron, Canton, Ohio area that were starting to meet. But unfortunately, like my father, a lot of the Vietnam vets became ill, and the groups and the Agent Orange first lawsuit settled. And that kind of just started to disband, because I think the Vietnam veterans kind of had this feeling that, okay, things are going to change now. Things are going to move forward. We're going to get these payouts. There's going to be money to help. And as you know, anyone who's done any research on that knows that that was not really what happened. So the movement kind of died as the veterans started to get more ill, as children grew. And in 2011, I started with the internet, starting to try to find other kids like me. And I started an organization called Children of Vietnam Veterans Health Alliance. And we have been in existence since 2011. We have about 5,000 members, other kids of Vietnam vets. We're still struggling because in so many ways our lives have been so affected by the Vietnam War. The children of female Vietnam veterans are acknowledged for around 16 birth defects. And those birth defects, while not acknowledged as caused by the chemical defoliant, they are the same birth defects that are seen in people who have children with birth defects who have been exposed to dioxin. So the VA got around this by doing a quick survey of women Vietnam veterans, asked them what their children suffered from, and compiled a list and said, okay, these are caused by a woman's service in Vietnam. And there was about 16 birth defects. And they also acknowledged spina bifida in the most rare forms in the children of male Vietnam veterans. However, the rest of the children of Vietnam veterans, if my mother was a Vietnam veteran, my birth defects would be acknowledged to be caused by my father's service in Vietnam. But because it was my father and not my mother, they are not acknowledged. There were 2.8 million men that served in Vietnam and around 7,500 to 8,000 women. So it's an economic choice that they most likely do not. They don't do the research that needs to be done. And I'll just end with saying that it's amazing to know Juan. I know Juan personally, and that's because of the work with Cubha and Vava and Veterans for Peace. And it has meant so much, you know, growing up so isolated, being the only kid I knew who had birth defects or problems from Agent Orange. And then as an adult, growing and connecting with the community and understanding that this is a humanitarian issue. And when we watch this film and we understand this film and where this webinar is coming from, it's so important to look at this as a global problem, that it's not just in Vietnam, it's not just in the Pacific coast of the United States, or it's a humanitarian problem, and people from all over the world have suffered from it. And so again, I just thank you all for coming, and I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. I was going to say, I seem to have, now I need to introduce myself. My name is Susan Schnall. I'm a member of the core, the Vietnam Agent Orange Relief and Responsibility Campaign, president of New York City chapter Veterans for Peace, member of Veterans for Peace Board, and lifetime member of Vietnam Veterans Against the War. For the past several years, I've worked with almost everybody on this panel and organized presentations about Agent Orange to the American Public Health Association annual meeting. Today, I'd like to speak with you about a little bit of the history of the spraying by the United States in Southeast Asia. Approximately 77 million liters, or 20 million gallons, of herbicides were sprayed over forests and cropland in southern Vietnam. And as we know today, thanks to the great work of Susan Hammond in Laos and Cambodia. On August 10, 1961, the first testing of chemical herbicides occurred in Canton province. 2 weeks later, a second run took place along Highway 13 north of what was then Saigon. On November 30th, 1961, President John Kennedy signed the National Security Action Memorandum about defoliant operations in South Vietnam that called for a selective and carefully controlled joint program of defoliant operations in Vietnam. Speaking completely against the contamination of food, and that only the most careful basis of resettlement and alternative food supply has been created. And then on January 13, 1962, the first official Operation Ranch Hand mission began. And as we know, they destroyed the food supply, they destroyed the people living in that area, and they moved whole populations around. The military use of herbicides in Vietnam took place until 1971. The herbicides were used to defoliate inland hardwood forests, coastal mangrove forests, cultivated lands, and zones around military bases. New research estimates that about 77 million liters were applied, about 9 million more liters than previous estimates. The investigators of the Institute of Medicine reviewed their original data from the use from the 1970s, and they kept identifying it and moving the amount upwards. There has been substantial dispute about the exact number of US military personnel who actually served in Vietnam. The estimates range from 2.6 to 4.3 million. About 5,000 to 8,000 women are thought to have been in the US military in Vietnam. There is no comprehensive or official roster of American Vietnam veterans. As many as 4.8 million Vietnamese may have been directly sprayed by 1971. From 1961 to 1971, the United States government undertook massive defoliation programs as an instrument of war. It systematically set out to destroy millions of acres of foliage from the air, over the years spraying an estimated 4.8 million Vietnamese and its own American troops on the ground. Spraying was conducted by backpacks around the perimeters of American military bases. The last of American troops left Vietnam April 30th, 1975. In 1977, this is 2 years later, Maud DeVictor was a low-level Veterans Administration bureaucrat when she first heard the words Agent Orange. She began asking questions and gathering information about the correlation between service in Vietnam and birth defects of children born to American veterans who had served in Vietnam. In 1978, Paul Rudershan, a Vietnam veteran from Norfolk, Connecticut, who was 27 years old, had developed late-stage gastric cancer and said on his deathbed, "I died in Vietnam and didn't even know." Finally, in August of 1990, there was a House committee report that found that a 1987 study canceled by CDC was done so because of the White House, compromising the independence of the CDC and undermining the study by controlling crucial decisions and guiding the course of research. At the same time, it had secretly taken a legal position to resist demands to compensate victims of Agent Orange exposure and industrial accidents. Finally, in 1991, the US Congress, concerned about long-term health defects of the sprayed herbicides, passed Public Law 102-4, the Agent Orange Act of 1991. The National Academy of Sciences began comprehensive evaluations of scientific and medical information regarding the health effects of exposure to Agent Orange and other herbicides used in Vietnam. As a result of those studies and recommendations from the Institute of Medicine, the United States Department of Veterans Affairs recognizes certain cancers and other health problems of, quote, presumptive diseases associated with exposure to Agent Orange. They are quickly AL amyloidosis, chronic B-cell leukemias, chloracne, diabetes, type 2, Hodgkin's ischemic heart disease, now Parkinson's disease, peripheral neuropathy, etc. The Veterans Administration recognizes a wide range of birth defects resulting in a permanent physical or mental disability as associated with women's veteran service in Vietnam, as Heather mentioned. But these are not related to exposure to Agent Orange. The VA ties these diseases to the birth mother service in Vietnam. So let me quickly go over 1991. Remember that boots on the ground, the American troops left Vietnam in April 1975. It was not until 1991 that Congress passed the Agent Orange Act. At the same time, recognizing soft tissue sarcoma and chloracne. In July 1993, the IOM recommended and the VA added Hodgkin's lymphoma and porphyria cutanea tarda. In September of 1993, the VA recognized respiratory cancers, multiple myeloma. 3 years later, the VA recognized spina bifida for the children of American male veterans and recommended peripheral neuropathy and prostate cancer also be on the presumed list. In 2000, ranch hand studies, and remember the ranch handers were the crew that flew the C-123s that sprayed the areas over southern Vietnam with Agent Orange. They recognized diabetes type 2. As Heather mentioned, in 2000, there was one special simple study done by Dr. Kang who identified multiple birth defects in the children of American service women who served in Vietnam. For our knowledge, that is the only study that has been done on American service women. In 2002, IOM suggested additional diagnosis be recognized. In 2002, the recommendation was that high blood pressure, hypertension, be recognized as a presumed illness. To date, this is 2021, hypertension has still not been recognized as a presumed illness. 2010, Parkinson's disease was added, ischemic heart disease, and certain forms of leukemia. In 2014, there was a recommendation that those who flew the C-123s 10 years after they had been flown in Vietnam, that they also been added to the list. In that year, there was a study done by South Korea on their veterans who had also served in Vietnam. And because the South Vietnamese were able to identify where their troops were located and then correlate where they were located with the development of certain illnesses. And those illnesses include bladder cancer, Parkinson's-like syndrome, hypothyroidism. Those three additional diagnoses were recommended in 2014 as also being confirmed as presumed illnesses of American service people who served in Vietnam. They were not recognized until this past summer, 2020, in August. The National Defense Authorization Act included these three additional illnesses for the American veterans who served in Vietnam. In 2016, there was an additional study done by the Army Chemical Corps. And these were the guys that handled the Agent Orange directly and sprayed from backpacks and helicopters. There was a special study done in 2016 that confirmed the recommendation from the National Academies of Science that hypertension or high blood pressure also be identified as a presumed illness. It is now 2021, and hypertension or high blood pressure is still not being recognized. As I said today, bladder cancer, hypothyroidism, and Parkinson's-like symptoms have been approved for VA coverage by the House and Senate. However, that has not yet been transferred to the VA as a presumed illness, and high blood pressure is still not recognized. There have been a number of studies by those and on those who flew the planes, the C-123s. There were additional studies done on the Army Chemical Corps who handled the herbicide directly, and still high blood pressure, even though it has been recognized, has still not been added to the list of presumed illnesses. This herbicidal warfare program has been considered by most of the international community to be a violation of international law and a war crime. In 1969, the United Nations General Assembly approved a resolution restating the 1925 Geneva Protocol that prohibited the use of chemical or biological agents in international conflicts. The resolution specifically declared as a violation of that treaty the use of any chemical agents of warfare, whether gaseous, liquid, or solid, which might be employed because of their direct toxic effects on man, animal, or plants. In every country and every culture, we believe that our children are our future. Our children are to be loved, treasured, cared for. As adults, we take that responsibility as the most important work we do in life. It is our nature to protect our children from harm. We watch over them when they're ill. We cry with them when they're in pain. We protect them from those who would harm them. How do we prevent hurt from an unseen enemy? From something we carry in our bodies and transmit to them unknowingly. The dioxin in Agent Orange not only impacts the lives of those who were in Vietnam during the American War, causing deteriorating illnesses and death, but it can also be transmitted to children, causing changes in cells that last multiple generations, causing birth defects and problems for the children and grandchildren of those directly exposed. The legacy of that conflict continues with the birth of babies with severe birth defects from the use of Agent Orange over 60 years ago. Babies who never volunteered for the military, who never held a gun or dropped a bomb, whose parents were in southern Vietnam, whose parents may have been in Oregon or another part of the United States, and who became the target for this chemical herbicide. We leave many toxic elements behind after a war. In Southeast Asia, we left poison in the land and the people. Thank you. Following me is Jonathan Moore, who is a senior partner in the New York law firm Beldrock, Levine, and Hoffman. Jonathan represented the Vietnamese nationals and the Vietnam Association for the Victims of Agent Orange Dioxin in a landmark case in the United States, seeking to hold the chemical companies that manufactured and supplied Agent Orange and other poisonous herbicides to the United States government during the American War in Southeast Asia. He wanted to hold them liable for the harm created by that use. Jonathan is on the board of the Vietnam Agent Orange Relief and Responsibility Campaign. Jonathan.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you everybody for taking the time out of your day to listen to these presentations, these very important presentations. just a reminder, Susan went over it, but the massive amount of spraying that occurred and release of dioxin that occurred in Vietnam over 10 years. And this is not a one-time exposure. This is constant exposure, year, day after day, month after month, year after year, for 10 years. It's affected 12% of the land in Vietnam. And it's estimated that it covered 5.55 million acres. And that, as we said, 2.1 to 4.8 million Vietnamese were exposed. There has been ongoing efforts over the years to try to seek compensation both for veterans and for the Vietnamese with regard to what happened in Vietnam. There was a lawsuit that was filed by veterans back in the 80s that resulted in a settlement in a federal district court in Brooklyn. And the chemical companies, that was against the chemical companies. And they agreed to pay $197 million to the veterans, which, given the large amount of people who were claiming injury as a result of their exposure, amounted to very little to each individual. And one of the stipulations in that lawsuit was that, in that settlement, was that it would not include people whose symptoms from their exposure to Agent Orange occurred after the lawsuit was settled. So subsequent to that, as Susan has said, there was the Agent Orange Act of 1991, which provided significant compensation over a growing number of illnesses over the years to veterans who were exposed to Agent Orange. In 2005, it was estimated that $1.5 billion was spent each year for that compensation. It's been estimated that I think conservatively we can say, since that act was passed, that the U.S. government has probably spent somewhere in the range of $75 billion to compensate veterans who were exposed to Agent Orange. That begins to set the framework for understanding what about the Vietnamese. In 2004, we brought a lawsuit, as Susan said, against the various chemical companies. We couldn't sue the U.S. government because of a thing called sovereign immunity. You can't sue the U.S. government unless they allow you to sue them, and they didn't in this case. And we had to frame our claim as a violation of the Alien Tort Claims Act, which is an interesting law that was passed, the first act ever signed into law in 1789. Was the Alien Tort Claims Act, that provides a remedy for, quote, aliens, non-citizens, non-residents of the U.S. to sue individuals for harm caused to them. Under a very narrow reading of the law, the courts allowed certain claims to go forward against these chemical companies under the Alien Tort Claims Act. After 4 years of litigation of that case, there was another veterans case that was filed as well, for those whose injuries didn't surface until after the previous lawsuit had been settled. In 2008, those cases were dismissed by the federal district court, and that dismissal was affirmed both by the Second Circuit Court of Appeals and by the United States Supreme Court in 2008. And the primary basis on which those cases were dismissed was the claim that Agent Orange was a mere herbicide. It was not designed. It was not a poison. It was not created as a poison. It was not conceived as a poison, and that although it contained undeniably poisonous components like dioxin, it was unintended and collateral to the mission of the spraying of the herbicides. I would suggest to you, and I think we proved throughout our case, that this was far from unintended and far from collateral. And then in litigating this case, although we were unsuccessful in the courts, I think we've clearly shown to the court of public opinion that a terrible wrong was done to the Vietnamese, and it continues to this day to be a stain on our national character. and that our country has never come to grips with the need to deal with both the remediation of, in a comprehensive way, of the land that was contaminated by dioxin, and the millions of Vietnamese and their descendants who have been negatively affected by exposure to dioxin. There are 5 principles that when you talk about Agent Orange that I think you have to understand and what we learned from this case. First of all, dioxin is a poison. And it was designed to cause serious harm to humans. The American Heritage Dictionary defines poison as a substance that causes injury, illness, or death. Clearly, dioxin met that standard. And I think the courts have had to acknowledge that dioxin in and of itself is a poisonous chemical. But as I've said, they tried to minimize its impact by saying it was unintended and collateral. The second point that I think we need to understand and keep in mind is that the chemical companies who produced dioxin knew that their products contained a poison, dioxin, as well as other toxic chemicals. These chemicals that they sold to the U.S. government were consistently many times higher than what would have been allowed for domestic U.S. use in comparable products. That is a fact which is beyond dispute. Despite this knowledge, the defendants did not take adequate or reasonable measures, I should say the chemical companies, to reduce the dioxin content of their products or otherwise prevent or mitigate their toxicity to humans. Indeed, the dioxin contamination, some of the samples that have been tested were several factors higher than what was allowed in terms of the level of if you want, safe dioxin that would be in the chemical. The third thing that I think we have to understand and that we learned from this case, that the presence of dioxin was unnecessary and was present only because the chemical companies failed to follow their proper procedures in the manufacture of their products. This was not something they learned only in 1970. The government, when it requested these chemicals, these herbicides from these chemical companies, said they have to be safe to handle while in storage, shipment, or operation, and should not be injurious to the health of man and animals. We know from what we've learned in this case that just the opposite was true. What the chemical companies did was to produce, they knew that the more dioxin they produced, the more money they would make. So they lowered the standards in the manufacturing. And by lowering the standards, that led to the process of contamination of dioxin and these chemicals. The chemical companies knew way back in the 50s that from the experience of German companies like Boehringer, that higher temperatures and more pressure led to greater dioxin content. So the chemical companies knew well before they even thought about using these chemicals in Vietnam that there was a safe way to produce herbicides and there was an unsafe way. They chose the unsafe way because they made more money doing it. The fourth, I think, important principle that we've learned from these cases, that the chemical companies knew that the presence of dioxin and other toxic chemicals posed a grave health risk to human beings, animals, and the environment. A number of memos that were written by the chemical companies before and during the time in question demonstrate the defendant's depth of knowledge as to the extreme toxicity of dioxin. In a 1957 letter between two chemical companies, they described dioxin as a really sinister character. 1957 memo from one of the chemical companies calls dioxin an extremely toxic material. A Monsanto memo refers to information that they learned from Dow, which said, according to Dow, it is the most toxic compound that they have ever experienced. Another Monsanto memo from 1965 suggests that very conceivably dioxin can be a potent carcinogen. These are just a few examples of the knowledge that they had of the harm that was caused by dioxin. The fifth principle that we take from this litigation was that the product, these chemicals were employed by the United States government as part of a chemical warfare operation in Vietnam. The chemical companies knew that their product would be put to, what use their product would be put to, and they knew that that product that they were selling to the United States was many times stronger and more unsafe than what's permitted for domestic use. And they viewed and they understood that dioxin was to be used as a weapon of war. There was a memo from a General Dellamore, who was the commander of the U.S. Army's Edgewood Arsenal, where he said, and I quote, "And remember, today we are not engaged in a war in Southeast Asia." This is back before we actually really jumped in. "We are not engaged in a war in Southeast Asia. We are only advisors, assisting that country to carry on. But tomorrow morning, perhaps we may be engaged in similar type operations, not over there, but perhaps in some other part of the world. We never know when this is going to happen. We are in need right now of chemicals that will do the job at an earlier time and in a quicker period." It is an irrefutable fact and a lasting legacy of the shame of the Vietnam War that these chemical companies, these employed, knew that these herbicides were being employed as chemical weapons with little regard for human life in Vietnam. Entire areas of the country were denuded, forcing the movement of people out of their natural habitat, leading to forced relocation, entire villages into resettlement camps. The mangrove forests in the south of Vietnam were decimated. Indeed, this indiscriminate use of chemical weapons was not just part of the military campaign, it was also part of a psychological warfare campaign to destroy the will of the indigenous people of Vietnam to fight for their liberation. And it was upon this knowledge that we argued that this conduct of these chemical companies violated well-established principles of international law that prohibited the use of poisons in war.
Thank you, Jonathan.
So, I just wanted to end by saying it is a lasting shame of this country, and it's so immoral that we have not fully addressed these issues with respect to the Vietnamese. Our position, of course, has never been that veterans should not get the maximum amount of compensation that they can, but it's well past time that we begin to deal with the harm caused to Vietnam. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you. It's our next guest speaker is Tricia Uvard, and it's wonderful to have her with us. Thank you, Tricia. She's joining us from Paris. It's, I think, the next day there right now. Tricia is a master's student in gender studies and law at SOAS, University of London. She's currently conducting an autoethnographic research as her thesis, which focuses on the ways that identity and gender intersect within the Vietnamese diaspora in France, specifically in the context of being biracial. She is a member of the Collective Vietnam Dioxin, and she primarily works on the international aspect of the mutual fight for reparations for victims of Agent Orange. Thank you so much for joining us today. I think some of us may be very familiar with the work of your collective and the wonderful publicity that it's generated concerning the impact of the Americans' use of Agent Orange all those many years ago. Tricia, welcome.
Thank you for having me today, and thank you to everyone who's here. and for taking the time to attend this webinar. It's an honor to be on this panel with so many great speakers and to be able to talk about the actions that we've taken here in France with the collective. A little bit about myself. I'm a second generation French Vietnamese from my mother's side. But in reality, I did not learn about Agent Orange until I was an adult and until I started reading and researching on my own. This is something that's been really echoed within the Vietnamese diaspora here in France. Agent Orange isn't really something that we learn about in school. It's not something that most people, even growing up with a Vietnamese heritage, hear about unless they have a family member or a friend or a relative who's been directly affected by Agent Orange. It's something that's very much erased, I think, from our history, and that it's something that with the group that I'm working with and I'm a part of, that we're really trying to reclaim and to make known. Before I continue, I do have to say that I am not speaking today in the name of Trentonia, even though I will be speaking about her case. But I'm only speaking as a member of the collective, and the opinions and comments that are expressed today are just mine. So I'm going to give a little bit of a background on who we are and what we do. We were created in the early 2000s in France, and we advocate for recognition and reparations towards victims of Agent Orange, specifically in Vietnam, but also more largely for all victims of ecocides like chlordecone, which is a pesticide that's been used in Guadeloupe and Martinique, which are still colonized territories by France in the Caribbean. Beyond our work that's specific to Agent Orange, we are an organization which fights for justice and mutual liberation. And we are involved in supporting and working with environmental groups, anti-racist movements, feminist movements, LGBTQIA+ movements, and anti-ableist movements. Our fight has always been and will always be intersectional in nature. We are entirely volunteer run, and each member helps however they can and within their capacity. We also firmly believe in running our organization in a horizontal manner and not in a hierarchical one, which means that each member gets a say in the final decision process. We get to each have opportunities if we want to have them. And it's something that's been really core to the way that we run things, and that's been really beneficial, I think, for every member. I joined the coalition actually in the beginning of December 2020, so I really have not been involved nearly as long as some of the other members have been. And they've really truly done so much of the uplifting and organizing around raising awareness on what Agent Orange is and on the consequences of it, as well as around Trentonia's trial. So to continue, I'm going to quickly go over who she is and what her case has been and how much of a legal precedent it's setting for other victims around the world. So Trentonia was a woman, or is a woman, sorry, who was part of the resistance to liberate South Vietnam during the Vietnam War. And during that time, she was sprayed by Agent Orange and worked in several zones which had been impacted by the herbicide. And at the time, no one really knew of Agent Orange and how dangerous it truly was and still is. But as a result of her exposure to Agent Orange, she developed severe illnesses, and she now has cancer among having type 2 diabetes, genetic abnormalities, and hypertension. Her children and grandchildren are also impacted by this exposure, as many have been, as we've heard from Juan and Heather earlier. And she lost her first child due to congenital heart defects, and her two other daughters who are still alive both live with severe asthma, heart issues, and other genetic defects. There's a lot more that you can learn about her through the film. And just in general, there has been a lot of articles about her. And yeah, So I'm going to go a little bit over the trial and the important dates and what it's been like here. So the legal procedures started in 2014 and were originally against 37 firms, but the number was then reduced to 26 due to the merging or disappearing of some of these firms. And only 14 of them stood trial this January. Some of these firms are Monsanto, Dow Chemicals, Uniroyal, and Hercules Incorporated. Trentonia is French Vietnamese, and she obtained the French nationality once she arrived in France and was naturalized. And because she was directly exposed to Agent Orange, she fulfills all the requirements under French law to sue the American companies responsible for producing and distributing Agent Orange. And to our knowledge, she is the only person that is currently able to do this here. And if she wins, this will set a precedent for other victims of Agent Orange, as this will be a landmark case. At the end of 2019, Trentonia and the chemical firms were offered the possibility of negotiating a financial settlement in return for a non-disclosure agreement that she would sign. She refused, as she considered that dropping the trial will be a way for the firms to get away with the crimes that they committed. But negotiating large sums of money in return for a non-disclosure agreement isn't something that's new to firms like Monsanto and the other ones who stood trial. In June 2020, 100,000 victims of glyphosate in California were paid about $10 billion in return for them signing a non-disclosure agreement. And so after several rescheduling of the trial date, it was held on January 25th, 2021. And the fact that her trial was held in itself is a historic moment for her, for us, but also for all other victims of Agent Orange. There's been several cases that were filed against Dow, Monsanto, and others, but none have ever gone as far as she has. And her case and the movements and awareness that was raised around her truly set a precedent for other victims of Agent Orange. And since she first filed her case with the French justice system, the lawyers of the defense have done everything in their power to slow down the process. They've raised incidents, which required lengthy and expensive official translations of documents. And as they are multinationals, they have financial abilities that we and her do not have. They are very aware of this, and the weight of their money could be seen and was really obvious if you were in the trial room or if you saw images of it, as there was 20 plus lawyers on the defense versus Trentonia's 3 lawyers who are working pro bono, I believe. We're now waiting for the verdict, which will be announced on May 10th, 2021. And either side will then be able to make an appeal, which we know will happen, as we are very aware that they will not go down without a fight, but neither will we. So what now? On January 30th, the collective held a large rally in support to Trentonia and victims of Agent Orange, as well as other victims of ecocides, because this is a problem that we believe is much bigger than just Agent Orange. And we're trying to really work with other groups in France and internationally to recognize these things. And on May 15th of this year, 5 days after the verdict of the trial will fall, we are co-organizing the International March Against Monsanto here in France and hope to be able to collaborate with other organizations to make this a more global movement despite the ongoing pandemic. And I will conclude while saying that we are still fighting and we will continue to fight for the justice, reparations, and mutual liberation, no matter what. Thank you.
Thank you, Tricia. And we're all looking forward to joining with you on an international movement against the chemical companies and to keep this issue of the American use of Agent Orange dioxin alive and moving forward until we are able to truly take care of those who have been victimized by our government and by the chemical companies. Our next speaker is Paul Cox, a veteran of the American War on Vietnam, who is in the Marines. Since his tour, he has been active against that war and all wars. He has worked on one of the main legacies of the war, Agent Orange, since 2005, and has returned to Vietnam 5 times to educate himself and others about its lingering effects. He is a long-term member of Veterans for Peace and is currently on its national board. He is also on the board of Swords to Plowshares Veterans Rights Organization and is the president of Veterans Healthcare Policy Institute. Paul Cox.
You're muted, Paul.
Oh, never fails, huh? Thank you, everybody, for coming today. And thanks for the really hard work that all the presenters, especially Susan and Greta and Samantha Ferguson at Veterans for Peace, have put in on making this possible. I'm going to just speak briefly, where'd my notes go, on the current situation in Vietnam in terms of both the remediation and care for the Agent Orange victims that are there. As was said earlier, there are approximately 3 million Vietnamese whose health has been affected by their exposure or their parents' exposure during the war or their exposure after the war to the dioxin that was sprayed throughout southern and central Vietnam. I don't, unless I missed it, I don't believe it was mentioned that of the 19 million gallons of Agent Orange, generic Agent Orange that was sprayed, approximately 10% or almost 2 million gallons was Agent Blue, which was not, did not have dioxin in it. It was an arsenic compound whose sole function was to kill grasses, specifically crops, specifically rice, that was grown, which was a war crime at the time. The US and the chemical companies have slithered out from under responsibility for the problems with Agent Orange because, after all, it was just an herbicide and it wasn't intended to hurt people. But poisoning crops has been a crime since, I believe, Jonathan, correct me if I'm wrong, 1915, and that's an issue that does not get that's a part of this issue that does not get a lot of play. That killing crops in order to starve people, civilians and or military, is not a proper way to conduct a war. You know, so that's still an issue. So since the war, there have been a number of studies done by Gene Stellman, by the Hatfield Group, and others in Vietnam, largely funded by a few bucks that were relatively few bucks that have been pried loose from various appropriations bills by Senator Leahy in his war victims fund that he set up a long time ago. And it's not that money has come from US Congress, not just for Vietnam, but for a number of war victims areas of the world. And by the hard work by a number of veterans organizations and humanitarian organizations for a long time. For about 10 years, the Ford Foundation was heavily involved and put several millions of dollars into ensuring that there were studies made in Vietnam to try to determine, to characterize the extent of the damage. And those studies, there's many of those studies, they're quite, in some cases quite dense and in some cases quite useful, but they have been used to characterize that they've come to a conclusion that there are at least 28 hotspots that is areas of severe contamination by dioxin and/or arsenic in Vietnam. And three of those hotspots are the big air bases where Agent Orange was sprayed. There was a fourth, Tan Son Nhut Air Base, which is the big air base and airport currently in Saigon or Ho Chi Minh City. But it was a very short period of time that was used as a base. So the three hotspots were Da Nang, Phuket, and Bien Hoa, from north to south. The Da Nang airport was the first one that the United States, after many years of ignoring and actually refusing to sit at the table with the Vietnamese in bilateral negotiations, if they wanted to talk about Agent Orange, finally the US decided to step up and have a conversation about that. So the Da Nang airport was the first one that came up. The Vietnamese asked that be characterized carefully, the extent of contamination be characterized carefully. And the US and the Ford Foundation funded those efforts through a number of studies. And eventually the United States committed to cleaning it up. They finished in November of 2017. They remediated 94,000 cubic meters of contaminated soil and sediments that were on the air base. That's a lot of dirt. And they did it with a process called thermal desorption, which they basically heat it to 500 degrees. And at that point, either the materials will volatilize off and can be removed from the containment that they were in and heated again to destroy any volatilized poisons, or they break down in situ. And so by that time, it cost $116 million, which was twice the cost and took 3 times as long as they had initially projected. And that gave everybody pause on how do we proceed. And so it's been a while that they've been talking about how to deal with the other 2 big hotspots, Phuket and Bien Hoa. In the meantime, while that was being done, Phuket has a very the area that was contaminated was small and the amount was relatively small. The Vietnamese and the US decided to cap that. That is, they put it into a containment. That is separated from the water table and has a big pile of soil on it and is capped with impermeable, either clay or rubber membranes. And so it's this huge sort of mound in the middle of the Phuket Air Base that is now considered contained and stable. And there is no further work being contemplated that I'm aware of on that particular site. The third one, Bien Hoa, is a problem. It's 3 times the size, both in area and in volume of contaminated soil than Da Nang was. And so it's going to cost, if it cost $116 million for Da Nang, it's going to cost well over $500 million for Bien Hoa. Moreover, the Bien Hoa site has drained for all these years kind of off the site and into residential areas in the city of Bien Hoa and which is right next to Saigon. And that's going to be a problem. So the current status is that the United States and Vietnam have signed an agreement that is not written in stone yet, but it seems like a pretty solid agreement to spend $450 million over the next 10 years. 300 million of that is going to come from the United States Department of Defense at the rate of $30 million a year for 10 years. Now, I think that when it goes to $500 million or more, I think the U.S. is kind of on the hook now. They're hooking and they're just going to have to keep reeling it in until they get the thing cleaned up. So whatever it costs, it may run to $1 billion. But at this point, they've committed 300 million. That's the remediation. So that leaves 25 hotspots or so that we know about. Now, those were all characterized by Gene Stellman when she did a study of U.S. military bases and ARVN military bases where Agent Orange was sprayed on the base and around the perimeter of the base to keep the weeds down so that those nasty Vietnamese couldn't sneak up on us while we were sleeping. And they've done a small survey of those. They've gone to several of those sites and taken 1 or 2 samples. And in some of them, they find out that indeed there is contamination. In others, they did not find contamination, but the sample size was so small, they proved nothing really. But that's just the old military bases where we sprayed it into the wire. What it probably exists are other military or other places around the country that were heavily sprayed, but were not part of our military bases. So there's woods outside of Saigon. There's the Cu Chi area, not just the Cu Chi base, but the Cu Chi area around it that was sprayed time and time again. The Cao Mau Peninsula, which was a mangrove forest down at the southern tip of Vietnam, that was utterly destroyed during the war. Now the mangrove has recovered, and you can't see it anymore, but the dioxin and or arsenic that were sprayed into those locations is probably still really present in the sediment. Dioxin is very durable in the environment. You have to expose it directly to sunlight or ultraviolet light for it to slowly break down. So if you've got dirt where there was dioxin, where the herbicide soaked into the ground, really the top centimeter might be fine, but when you dig into it, when you go further, you're going to find contamination that's going to exist for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So that's a problem, is what is going to be done in the future for additional hotspots that we know about or that we don't know about but need to find. And so that takes care of the remediation, I think, of the herbicide spraying. One more factoid about herbicides is that the herbicides themselves, Agent Orange and all the others, the 2,4-D, the 2,4,5-T, Agent White and Pink, and all, they break down pretty quickly in the environment, but they have destroyed the jungles where they were sprayed. As I said, they destroyed the mangrove forest. So the herbicides are gone, but the forest has been destroyed. Now, the mangrove forest grew back, but the jungles, once destroyed, just like the Amazon, once you rip it down, it is not coming back. And so there are huge areas in the highlands in Vietnam that the jungle was destroyed by the war. And what you have now are invasive species, scrub oak, scrub bushes, and invasive grasses and such, that the jungle has been very badly damaged. There is nothing to be done for that except to try to plant more trees that are native trees. What the Vietnamese are doing, however, is planting a lot of acacia, which comes from Australia, because it's a good pulp plant and fast growing, and will help stabilize the soil, but it may preclude there ever being jungle there. Enough for the remediation issues. The other part of the situation are the 3 million Vietnamese who have been affected by Agent Orange. The US has spent most of about $200 million that it has appropriated between 2011 and 2019. They've spent about $200 million. They've appropriated about $200 million for that remediation. But they've only appropriated $66 million for the health and disability services without regard to cause. So that's, if you take, there's 3 million Vietnamese whose health has been affected, that's about $22 a person. Not bad, it's plenty, huh? You think that should do it? So the fact that there are so many people in Vietnam who have been made sick by their exposures or their parents' exposure, it's really a disgustingly small amount that has been allocated to assist the Vietnamese. And that needs to change. So along that line, we Congresswoman Barbara Lee speaks for me. I'm her constituent. We'll be reintroducing a bill. It was HR 326 in the last Congress, and it'll be reintroduced in only slightly updated forms sometime in the next month or two, we hope, called the Victims of Agent Orange. Help me out, Susan. Victims of Agent Orange Relief Act of 2021, and it doesn't have a number yet. And it has 5 provisions: clean up the mess, that is the remediation in Vietnam, assistance to the Vietnamese public health system to help Vietnamese victims, the really direct help, not money compensation, but direct help to assist the public health system in Vietnam to help those people who are affected by Agent Orange. The third part is assistance to the children of Vietnam veterans who don't get anything at this point, and that's what Heather spoke so eloquently to. The fourth thing is to study and assist the Vietnamese Americans in this country who we don't even know what their situation is. And so the first part of that would be a study. And the fifth element would be to do research that the VA has always refused to do, even though the Institute of Medicine has suggested that they look at their own data and other research in order to really answer some of the unanswered but very disturbing questions about the science behind the health effects of dioxin exposures. So that bill will be coming up. The thing that everybody on this call could do would be to urge your congressperson to co-sponsor that bill before it's even introduced, and become a co-sponsor with Barbara Lee, Congresswoman Barbara Lee from Oakland, or sponsor it after it's introduced is also fine, co-sponsoring it. But to sign on right out of the gate would be very, very helpful and very important. Lastly, in August, the Vietnamese Association of Victims of Agent Orange has called for an international conference on Agent Orange this coming August, which is August 10th is Agent Orange Day in Vietnam. It's not clear yet whether they're going to be able to have presentations and present virtually. And it's certainly unclear whether anybody's going to be able to travel there in order to participate. But if you do have a chance to track that and follow it, I think there's going to be some very interesting aspects of that international conference on Agent Orange that we're going to learn some things about it. So
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
I am afraid I've been looking at the time and we have been on for about an hour and a half. Greta, would we be able to take any questions now? Do we still have a few minutes?
Yeah, I think for those who want to stay on, we can stay on for 5 minutes or so. I do see one question from Rick who's asking if you can share the bill details again. And we can send that in a follow-up email again, but if you could just repeat it.
It's HR 326.
It was.
Victims of Agent Orange Relief Act of 2019 was the last bill. And if you just Google HR 326, you'll find that. And the new bill will be very similar.
And we would really like for everybody to become involved in the campaign, to ask your representative, your congressperson, to sign on to this. We use this bill as an educational tool to keep on informing people about the continuing damage of Agent Orange dioxin. And we really need your help in being able to do that. It's part of our program is about the use of the Agent Orange dioxin in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. The rest is to remind the American people that this government continues its damage and its destruction overseas. There are over 800 United States military bases all over the world, and every place there is one, there is a contamination. So part of our campaign is to remind people about the damage from 60 years ago, and it's to remind you all that that damage continues today. We have responsibilities as people of this country and as citizens to say no to the government and to say this is an example, but we will continue to campaign against the use of these destructive forces all over the world. Thank you all for coming. I guess I would really like to conclude with a poem about Agent Blue by a Vietnamese writer, Teresa May Chuk. To kill correctly takes calculation down to a science. Arsenic, cacodelic acid, no water and rice on a cellular level. Make sure no surviving seed can be collected and planted, because even a small seed assures survival, because mortars, grenades, and bombs cannot destroy a grain, because our heart is made of seeds. Know what it takes to kill the seeds. Know what it takes to deprive the plant of water, to dehydrate it, to be surrounded by love, but unable to absorb it. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening. You will be hearing more from us in the future as we continue to work together. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, everyone. We will send a follow-up email with the recording and additional information, as well as the link to the film, The People versus Agent Orange, which sort of inspired this webinar. And also just a final plug that we're doing a second webinar on this topic on April 22nd, Earth Day at 7 p.m. Eastern, same time, which will focus again on Agent Orange and specifically on its environmental impact given Earth Day. So that's all for tonight, and hope to see you at the
Can I
next
just say,
one.
and thank you to Susan for being an excellent chair of the meeting.
Yes, thank you, Susan.
It's been a pleasure, and thank you, World Beyond War and Veterans for Peace, for working with us and getting this together. It's been a pleasure.
And one last thing, if you block and save the chat, you can keep it and put it into Word document and find and not lose that information.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.